of Mice and Men, Chapter 5, page 93. Then gradually time awakened again and moved sluggishly on. The horses stomped on the other side of the feeding racks, and the halter chains clinked. Outside, the men's voices became louder and clearer. From around the end of the last stall, old Candy's voice came. "Lenny?" he called. "Oh, Lenny, you in here? I've been figuring some more. Tell you what we can do, Lenny." Old Candy appeared around the end of the last stall. "Oh, Lenny!" he called again, and then he stopped, and his body stiffened. He rubbed his smooth wrist on his white stubble whiskers. "I didn't know you was in here," he said to Curly's wife. When she didn't answer, he stepped nearer. "You oughtn't to sleep out here," he said disapprovingly, and then he was beside her, and, "Oh, Jesus Christ!" He looked about helplessly, and he rubbed his beard, and then he jumped up and went quickly out of the barn. But the barn was alive now. The horses stomped and snorted, and they chewed the straw of their bedding, and they clashed their chains of their halters. In a moment, Candy came back, and George was with him. George said, "What was it you wanted to see me about?" Candy pointed at Curly's wife. George stared. "What's the matter with her?" he asked. He stepped closer, and then he echoed Candy's words. "Oh, Jesus Christ!" He was down on his knees beside her, put his hand over her heart, and finally, when he stood up, slowly and stiffly, his face was hard and tight as wood, and his eyes were hard. Candy said, "What done it?" George looked coldly at him. "Ain't you got any idea?" he asked, and Candy was silent. "I should have knew," George said hopelessly. "I guess maybe way back in my head I did." Candy asked, "What are we going to do now, George? What are we going to do now?" George was a long time in answering. "Guess we got to tell the guys. I guess we got to get him and lock him up. We can't let him get away, or the poor bastard would starve." And he tried to reassure himself. Maybe they'll lock him up and be nice to him. But Candy said excitedly, "We ought to let him get away. You don't know that Curly. Curly's going to want to get him lynched. Curly'll get him killed." So here's the lynched now. So light and dark, Alex, Diaz, light and dark. Lynching parties, lynching block parties. Everyone dressed up for them. Now they're going to lynch a white guy, or at least they're worrying about lynching a white guy. Light and dark, good and evil. And he's guilty of murder. I mean, he probably shouldn't get away with it, but is a non-judicial killing equal? I mean, a lynching is extrajudicial. It's not judicial. So shouldn't he?
Especially who is going to deal out said justice, especially if it was kind of an accident. Lenny really didn't mean to.
Right.
If they are really going to dole out a trial, who's going to dole out the sentence? Is it going to be the main farmer, the top guy, or is it going to be Curly? You know,
or how about a courtroom?
Yeah. How would a courtroom, treat a very evidently mentally disabled person? That is, technically a murderer, but in all means, it was more manslaughter than anything. Because he didn't mean to, And I'm not going to, defend him for doing what he did, but technically, Curly's wife started it. However, I don't think what he did is still okay.
Because remember, all we've heard is rumors about her being a slut. We have no evidence of it. The only evidence we have is that she's a nice person that wants to talk to people. And she's lonely. We have evidence of all that. We have no evidence of her stepping out on her man. We do have evidence of Curly stepping out on her, though. And so, if anything, she's a good wife by sticking by, like, not just, I'm going to divorce you now because you went to the whorehouse. I don't know.
Someone she admitted to not liking as well. She
Right.
admitted to Lenny that she didn't like him, and
George watched Candy's lips. Yeah, he said at last. That's right. Curly will, and the other guys will. And he looked back at Curly's wife. Now Candy spoke his greatest fear. You and me can get that little place, can't we, George? You and me can go there and live in nice, can't we, George? Can't we? So they're losing hope. Before George answered, Candy dropped his head and looked down at the hay. He knew. George said softly, I think I knowed from the very first. I think I knowed we'd never do her. He used to like to hear about it so much. I got to thinking maybe we would. Then it's all off, Candy asked sulkily. George didn't answer his question. George said, I'll work my month and I'll take my $50 and I'll stay all night in some lousy cat house, whorehouse, or I'll set in some pool room till everybody goes home, and then I'll come back and work another month, and I'll have $50 more. Candy said, He's such a nice fella. I didn't think he'd do nothing like this. George still stared at Curly's wife. Lenny never done it in meanness, he said. All the time he done bad things, but he never done 'em, one of 'em, mean. He straightened up and looked back at Candy. Now listen, we gotta tell the guys. They gotta bring him in, I guess. They ain't no way out. Maybe they won't hurt him, he said sharply. I ain't gonna let them hurt Lenny. Now you listen. The guys might think I was in on it. I'm gonna go in the bunkhouse. Then in a minute, you come out and tell the guys about her, and I'll come along and make like I never seen her. Will you do that so the guys won't think I was in on it? Candy said, Sure, George. Sure, I'll do that. Okay, give me a couple of minutes then, and you come running out and tell like you just found her. I'm going now. George turned and went quickly out of the barn. Old Candy watched him go. He looked helplessly back at Curly's wife, and gradually his sorrow and his anger grew into words. You goddamn tramp, he said viciously. You done it, didn't you? I suppose you're glad. Everybody knowed you'd mess things up. You wasn't no good. You ain't no good now, you lousy tart. He sniveled, and his voice shook. I could have hoed in the garden and washed dishes for them guys. He paused and then went on in a sing-song, and he repeated the old words. If there was a circus or a baseball game, we would have went to her. Just said to hell with work and went to her. Never asked nobody say so. And they'd have been a pig and chickens, and in the winter, the little fat stove and the rain coming, and us just setting there. His eyes blinded with tears, and he turned and went weakly out of the barn, and he rubbed his bristly whiskers with his wrist stump. Outside, the noise of the game stopped. There was a rise of voices in question. A drum of running feet, and men burst into the barn. Slim and Carlson and young Wit and Curly and Crooks keeping back out of attention range. Candy came after them, and last of all came George. George had put on his blue denim coat and buttoned it, and his black hat was pulled down low over his eyes. The men raced around the last stall. Their eyes found Curly's wife in the gloom. They stopped and stood still and looked. Then Slim went quietly over to her. He felt her wrist. One lean finger touched her cheek, and then his hand went under her slightly twisted neck, and his fingers explored her neck. When he stood up, the men crowded near, and the spell was broken. Curly came suddenly to life. I know who did it, he cried. That big son of a bitch done it. I know he done it. While everybody else was out there playing horseshoes. He worked himself into a fury. I'm gonna get him. I'm gonna go in for my shotgun. I'll kill the big son of a bitch myself. I'll shoot him in the guts. Come on, you guys. He ran furiously out of the barn. Carlson said, I'll get my Luger. And he ran out too. Slim turned quietly to George. I guess Lenny done it all right, he said. Her neck's bust. Lenny could have did that. George didn't answer, but he nodded slowly. His hat was so far down on his forehead that his eyes were covered. Slim went on. Maybe like that time in Weed you was telling about. Again, George nodded. Slim sighed. Well, I guess we gotta get him. Where do you think he might have went? It seemed to take George some time to free his words. He would have went south, he said. We come from north, so he would have went south. I guess we gotta get him, Slim repeated. George stepped close. Couldn't we maybe bring him in and they'll lock him up? He's nuts, Slim. He never done this to be mean. Slim nodded. We might, he said. If we could keep Curly in, we might. But Curly's going to want to shoot him. Curly's still mad about his hand. And suppose they lock him up and strap him down and put him in a cage. That ain't no good, George. I know, said George. I know. Carlson came running in. The bastard stole my Luger, he shouted. It ain't in my bag. Curly followed him, and Curly carried a shotgun in his good hand. Curly was cold now. All right, you guys, he said. The N's got a shotgun. You take it, Carlson. When you see him, don't give him no chance. Shoot for his guts. That'll double him over. Witt said excitedly, I ain't got no gun. Curly said, you go into Soledad and get a cop. Get Al Wiltz. He's deputy sheriff. Let's go now. He turned suspiciously on George. You're coming with us, fella. Yeah, said George. I'll come. But listen, Curly, the poor bastard's nuts. Don't shoot him. He didn't know what he was doing. Don't shoot him, Curly cried. He got Carlson's Luger. Course we'll shoot him, George said weakly. Maybe Carlson lost his gun. I seen it this morning, said Carlson. No, it's been took. Slim stood looking down at Curly's wife. He said, Curly, maybe you better stay here with your wife. Curly's face reddened. I'm going, he said. I'm going to shoot the guts out of the big bastard myself, even if I only got one hand. I'm going to get him. Slim turned to Candy. You stay here with her, then, Candy. The rest of us better get going. They moved away. George stopped a moment beside Candy, and they both looked down at the dead girl until Curly called, You, George, you stick with us so we don't think you had nothing to do with this. George moved slowly after them, and his feet dragged heavily. And when they were gone, Candy squatted down in the hay and watched the face of Curly's wife. Poor bastard, he said softly. The sound of the men grew fainter. The barn was darkening gradually, and, in their stalls, the horses shifted their feet and rattled the halter chains. Old Candy lay down in the hay and covered his eyes with his arm. The deep green pool of the Salinas River was still in the late afternoon. Already the sun had left the valley to go climbing up the slopes of the Gabalon Mountains, and the hilltops were rosy in the sun. But by the pool among the mottled sycamores, a pleasant shade had fallen. A water snake glided smoothly up the pool, twisting its periscope head from side to side, and it swam the length of the pool and came to the legs of a motionless heron that stood in the shadows. A silent head and beak lanced down and plucked it out by the head, and the beak swallowed the little snake while its tail waved frantically. A far rush of wind sounded, and a gust drove through the tops of the trees like a wave. The sycamore leaves turned up their silver sides. The brown, dry leaves on the ground scudded a few feet, and row on row of tiny wind waves flowed up the pool's green surface. As quickly as it had come, the wind died, and the clearing was quiet again. The heron stood in the shallows, motionless and waiting. Another little water snake swam up the pool, turning its periscope head from side to side. Suddenly, Lenny appeared out of the brush, and he came as silently as a creeping bear moves. The heron pounded the air with its wings, jacked itself clear of the water, and flew off downriver. The little snake slid in among the reeds at the pool's side. Lenny came quietly to the pool's edge. He knelt down and drank, barely touching his lips to the water. When a little bird skittered over the dry leaves behind him, his head jerked up, and he strained toward the sound with eyes and ears until he saw the bird, and then he dropped his head and drank again. When he finished, he sat down on the bank with his side to the pool so that he could watch the trail's entrance. He embraced his knees and laid his chin down on his knees. The light climbed on out of the valley, and as it went, the tops of the mountains seemed to blaze with increasing brightness. Lenny said softly, I didn't forget, you bet. Goddamn. Hide in the brush and wait for George. He pulled his hat down low over his eyes. George gonna give me hell, he said. George gonna wish he was alone and not have me bothering him. He turned his head and looked at the bright mountain tops. I can go right off there and find a cave, he said, and he continued sadly, and never have no ketchup, but I won't care. If George don't want me, I'll go away. I'll go away. My professor in college said that him pulling his hat down, just like George did when he walked into the barn the second time, was like a textual sign of the brotherhood between men, that they take on the personality of one another, and that the hat was the key to that thesis of his professor. And then from out of Lenny's,
Interesting thing.
it's very subtle, but it's hard to disagree with. And then from out of Lenny's head, there came a little fat old woman. She wore thick bullseye glasses, and she wore a huge gingham apron with pockets, and she was starched and clean. She stood in front of Lenny and put her hands on her hips, and she frowned disapprovingly at him. And when she spoke, it was in Lenny's voice. I told you, she said. I told you. Men George, because he's such a nice fella and good to you, but you don't never take no care. You do bad things. And Lenny answered her, I tried, Aunt Clara, ma'am. I tried and tried. I couldn't help it. You never give a thought to George, she went on in Lenny's voice. He's been doing nice things for you all the time. When he got a piece of pie, you always got half or more than half. And if there was any ketchup, why, he'd give it all to you. I know, said Lenny miserably. I tried, Aunt Clara, ma'am. I tried and tried. She interrupted him. All the time he could have had such a good time if it wasn't for you. He would have took his pay and raised hell in a whorehouse. And he could have sat in a pool room and played snooker. But he got to take care of you. Lenny moaned with grief. I know, Aunt Clara, ma'am. I'll go right off in the hills, and I'll find a cave, and I'll live there so I won't be no more trouble to George. You just say that, she said sharply. You're always saying that, and you know, son of a bitchin' well, you ain't never gonna do it. You just stick around and stew the bejesus out of George all the time. Lenny said, I might just as well go away. George ain't gonna let me tend no rabbits now. Aunt Clara was gone, and from out of Lenny's head there came a gigantic rabbit. It sat on its haunches in front of him, and it waggled its ears and crinkled its nose at him, and it spoke in Lenny's voice too. Tend rabbits, it said scornfully. You crazy bastard. You ain't fit to lick the boots of no rabbit. You'd forget him and let him go hungry. That's what you'd do. And then what would George think? I would not forget, Lenny said loudly. The hell you wouldn't, said the rabbit. You ain't worth a greased jackpin to ram you into hell. Christ knows George done everything he could to jack you out of the sewer, but it don't do no good. If you think George gonna let you tend rabbits, you're even crazier than usual. He ain't. He gonna beat hell out of you with a stick. That's what he's gonna do. Now Lenny retorted belligerently. He ain't neither. George won't do nothing like that. I've knew George since I forget when. He ain't never raised his hand to me with a stick. He's nice to me. He ain't gonna be mean. Well, he's sick of you, said the rabbit. He's gonna beat hell out of you and then go away and leave you. He won't, Lenny cried frantically. He won't do nothing like that. I know George. Me and him travels together. But the rabbit repeated softly over and over, He's gonna leave you, you crazy bastard. He's gonna leave you all alone. He's gonna leave you, crazy bastard. Laney put his hands over his ears. He ain't. I tell you he ain't. And he cried, oh, George, George, George. George came quietly out of the brush. and the rabbit scuttled back into Lenny's brain.